I never thought my life would take this turn. I was just living my routine, work, home, repeat, until a single phone call shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. I'm Kara, 36, and I've always been the other sister. My younger sister, Melanie, 33, has always been the favorite. She married young, settled down fast, and had a daughter, Sophie, now 7. Meanwhile, I focused on my career as a paralegal, bought my own place, and never really saw the need to follow the same path as her. But if you ask my parents, Melanie did everything right, and I was the one who just existed. For years, I watched them put her on a pedestal, bragging about how devoted she was as a wife and mother, how she made all the right choices. Me? I was just there. No husband, no kids, no stories they could show off at dinner parties. And honestly, I didn't care. I let them have their fantasy. But something always felt off about Sophie. She was too quiet for a kid her age. At family gatherings, she'd barely say a word, just clutching this old stuffed fox like it was the only thing keeping her together. She never ran around with the other kids, never laughed the way a child should, and she was small. Too small. I noticed, but every time I asked Melanie about it, she brushed me off. She's a picky eater, she'd say. She's just shy. And because I wasn't a parent myself, I let it go. I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Until the day I got the call. It was a regular Thursday morning. I was at work, buried in case files, when my phone buzzed. At first, I ignored it, but then I saw the voicemail notification. Something in my gut told me to listen. The voice on the other end was calm, but firm. Ms. Reynolds, this is Tina Morales with Child Protective Services. Your name is listed as an emergency contact for Sophie Grant. We need you to call back. Immediately. I froze. I must have dialed that number faster than I ever have in my life. Tina picked up on the first ring. Her tone was professional, but there was an underlying urgency. Sophie had been removed from Melanie's home due to neglect. Neglect. That word hit me like a freight train. They couldn't give me the full details over the phone, but they needed me to come to their office as soon as possible. I grabbed my bag and walked out of work without a word. I don't even remember the drive there, just that feeling in my stomach, like I already knew I had failed her. When I arrived, I spotted her instantly. Sophie was sitting in a chair, curled up around that same stuffed fox, her tiny fingers gripping it so tightly her knuckles were white. Her hair was a mess. Her face was pale. Her clothes were too thin for the cold weather outside. I crouched down in front of her, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, sweetheart. She didn't answer. Just a quick glance up before she looked. Back at the floor. Tina pulled me aside and laid it all out. Neighbors had reported seeing Sophie looking malnourished, wearing dirty clothes, and being left alone for hours. There had been multiple reports. CPS had checked in before, but this time was different. When they arrived, what they found was bad enough that they had to remove her immediately. I felt sick. I knew something was wrong. I had felt it for years, and I did nothing. Then my phone rang. Melanie. I stepped outside to take the call, and the second I answered, she was hysterical. This is a mistake. You have to tell them, Kara. You have to give her back to me. I barely got a word in. She was sobbing, screaming, saying CPS had a personal vendetta against her, that Sophie was just going through a phase. Then her tone shifted. Cold. Sharp. If you don't give her back, I will never forgive you. I hung up, and when I walked back inside, I made my decision. I'll take her. The next few weeks were a blur. I was granted temporary emergency custody while the legal process played out. The investigation was ongoing, and I knew it would take time before anything was settled. At first, Sophie barely spoke. She flinched at sudden movements, wouldn't eat much, and wouldn't sleep unless she was holding that fox. But little by little, she started to relax. I found out she loved peanut butter sandwiches. I started making them every day. She began eating more, sleeping better. One night, I walked past her room and saw her curled up under the blankets, breathing evenly. The first time she looked peaceful. Then she started talking. It wasn't much at first. Little pieces of her life, like she was testing if it was safe to say them out loud. She told me about going to bed hungry, about being locked in her room when she misbehaved, about how she wasn't allowed to cry because crying makes mommy mad. I wanted to scream. Instead, I just hugged her and whispered, "You're safe now." Meanwhile, Melanie wasn't done. She started telling everyone that I had stolen Sophie, that CPS had made a mistake, that I was just jealous of her perfect life. My parents ate it up. They called me, demanding I do the right thing and return Sophie. I told them if they really believed that, they should go ask CPS why they took her away in the first place. When they refused to listen, I stopped answering their calls. Then, one day, CPS told me something that made my blood run cold. They were investigating more than just neglect. There was evidence that Melanie's husband had been hurting Sophie, in ways I didn't even want to imagine. That night, Sophie called me mommy by accident. The second she said it, her eyes widened in panic, and she clamped a hand over her mouth like she had just said something wrong. I pulled her into my arms and whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now." And for the first time, she believed it. The first sign that Melanie wasn't going to back down? A knock at my door. A man in a suit handed me a thick envelope. Legal papers. Melanie was suing for full custody. The official language made it sound like I had kidnapped my own niece. My phone rang again. This time, my mother. Her voice was tight with anger. "This has gone far enough, Kara. Give Melanie her daughter back." There was no discussion, just a demand. I hung up. Then Sophie's nightmares started. She would wake up screaming, her small body shaking, her hands gripping the blankets so hard her fingers turned white. When I asked her what she dreamed about, she wouldn't say. Just stared at the walls, like she was afraid they could hear her. And Melanie wasn't just fighting in court. She took it to social media, posting about how I manipulated CPS, how her child was stolen from her, how she was a victim of a corrupt system. People believed her. Mutual friends started reaching out. Some were cautious. "Hey, what's really happening?" Others, not so kind. "I never thought you'd do something this low, Kara." I ignored it. I had bigger things to worry about. Then, one evening, something unexpected happened. Sophie laughed. Not a small chuckle. A full, real, joyful laugh. We were watching some silly cartoon and she just lost it, giggling, eyes bright like a kid should. For a moment, everything else faded. But I knew the battle was just beginning. I knew I needed help. I hired a lawyer, Maya Lopez, a no-nonsense family attorney with a reputation for taking on tough cases. She didn't sugarcoat anything. "This won't be easy," she said. "Melanie has money, she has connections. She's going to put on a show and the court is going to listen. But we have one thing she doesn't: evidence." The first court date came faster than I expected. Melanie arrived looking completely put together. Hair perfectly curled, a soft motherly dress, her makeup just right. Not too much, not too little. She had perfected the picture of a devoted mother. Her lawyer painted the image of a loving mom who had made a few mistakes. "She was overwhelmed," he said. "Single parenting is hard, but taking Sophie from her? That was extreme." Maya pushed back. She laid out CPS reports, medical records, witness statements. She described how Sophie looked when they found her, the weight loss, the bruises, the fact that she flinched when adults raised their voices. The judge didn't make a final ruling that day, but he refused to return Sophie to Melanie immediately. The custody order remained in place while the investigation continued. As we left the courtroom, Melanie stormed past me. "I will never let this stand," she muttered under her breath. The next day, an unexpected witness came forward. Melanie had always been careful about controlling the narrative. She was good at hiding the cracks, the messy house when guests weren't around, the way she spoke through gritted teeth when Sophie cried too long, the moments when she snapped, but only when no one was looking. But she had made one mistake. She had let too many people get close enough to see the truth. And now, they were starting to talk. Lena had been one of Melanie's babysitters. She wasn't family. She wasn't a friend. She had no reason to lie. And when she saw Melanie's sob story spreading online, something inside her snapped. She contacted my lawyer. At first, she was hesitant. "I was afraid back then," she admitted. "Afraid she'd come after me if I said anything." But now, she wasn't afraid anymore. She testified under oath. Sophie wasn't just neglected. She was punished. Lena recounted everything. Sophie wasn't allowed to cry. If she did, Melanie would tell her she was being dramatic and send her to her room. She was forced to eat alone. If she didn't finish her plate, she went to bed hungry. She wasn't allowed to play outside. Melanie would say it was too much work to watch her. She was locked in her room, hours at a time, sometimes entire nights. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. I heard Sophie begging her mom not to lock the door. The courtroom fell silent. Then Lena added one more thing. The reason she was fired, it wasn't because she had been late, or because she had done something wrong. It was because she tried to sneak Sophie food one night. I gave her a snack because she was crying about being hungry. I thought I was doing the right thing. But Melanie lost it, told her she was overstepping, told her she wasn't welcome in her house anymore. And just like that, Lena was gone. But now, she was back, and her words carried weight. Melanie's lawyer tried to spin it. That was years ago, he said. This is a woman with no qualifications in child development. How do we know she's remembering things correctly? But Maya, she wasn't having it. She walked to the evidence table, picked up the CPS reports, and laid them out, one by one. Medical records, statements from neighbors, photos from the day Sophie was removed. All of it matched Lena's story. There was no spinning that. The judge looked at Melanie. Do you have anything to say? Melanie shook her head. She wasn't crying now. She wasn't acting like the heartbroken mother. For the first time, she looked small, powerless, and the cracks in her story, they were starting to shatter. Outside the courtroom, things got worse for Melanie. She had built her entire defense on her social media following, but now, people were turning on her. Her latest posts were filled with questions she couldn't answer. Why didn't you fight for supervised visits earlier? Why is there so much evidence against you? Why are more people coming forward? Instead of responding, she started blocking comments. Then she turned off replies. Then, she deleted some of the posts entirely. But it was too late. The damage was done. And the worst part? She still thought she could win. Just when I thought. We had everything we needed. My lawyer got another call. From someone unexpected. A woman named Lauren. She used to be Melanie's best friend. But they had a falling out years ago. Now? She wanted to talk. And what did she have to say? It made everything worse. Melanie had always been the type to keep tight control over her image. She was careful about who she let in, careful about what people saw. But there was one person who had been inside long enough to see everything. Her husband. And now, he was turning against her. Ryan Grant had been noticeably absent during all of this. He hadn't shown up to court, hadn't made a statement, hadn't even posted online to defend Melanie. He was staying quiet. Too quiet. And when CPS started looking into him, he realized something. He wasn't just married to Melanie. He was on the hook too. So he did what selfish men do. He ran. And when he ran, he started talking. Through his lawyer, he offered to testify. The moment he stepped into the courtroom, I could see it. The shame, the guilt, the way he refused to look at Melanie. Maya wasted no time. She started with a simple question. Mr. Grant, did you ever witness Melanie mistreat Sophie? He hesitated. Then he sighed. And he said exactly what we needed to hear. Yes. The courtroom went silent. I watched Melanie's hands tighten into fists. Ryan kept talking. He said he had heard Sophie crying. He had seen the way she flinched when Melanie raised her voice. He had noticed the bruises. He had known. And he had done nothing. Maya leaned in. Why didn't you intervene? His jaw tightened. Because it was easier not to. That was the moment he sealed her fate. Melanie snapped. Right there, in court. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. You're a liar, she screamed at him. The judge immediately banged his gavel. Sit down, Ms. Grant. She did. But the damage was already done. Ryan had painted the final picture of what was happening behind closed doors. The bruises weren't accidents. The crying wasn't a phase. The fear wasn't overreacting. It was real. And now, everyone knew. My lawyer had one more trick up her sleeve. Before Ryan left the stand, she presented bank records. 2 months before CPS got involved, Ryan had moved thousands of dollars out of their joint account. Quietly. Secretly. Maya turned to the judge. This wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just abuse. It was premeditated. Mr. Grant knew this was coming, and he was preparing to leave before it happened. Ryan didn't deny it. He just stared at the table. Melanie? She looked at him like she wanted to kill him. And for the first time, I saw fear in her eyes. Because now, she knew. She was losing. Melanie always had a plan. She thought she could control this. She believed that if she played the victim hard enough, people would listen. But after Ryan's testimony, her world was crumbling. And desperate people? They do desperate things. The day after court, Melanie tried a new angle. If she couldn't win legally, she would win publicly. She started showing up at church events, standing in front of people with tears in her eyes, talking about redemption and second chances. She wrote guest posts on mom blogs claiming she was a victim of a corrupt legal system. And then, she did the worst thing of all. She set up a GoFundMe. She called it, "Help a Mother Reunite with Her Stolen Child." She begged for money to fight the injustice. For a moment, I panicked. What if people believed her? What if she actually raised enough money to drag this battle out even longer? But then, something incredible happened. It flopped. People weren't donating. They were asking questions. And when Melanie started deleting comments instead of answering them, the last of her supporters started falling away. Within a week, the GoFundMe was quietly deleted. Her redemption tour, dead on arrival. But she wasn't done yet. At this point, something shifted. The more Melanie fought, the worse it got for her. Because more people were coming forward. A former neighbor submitted an anonymous statement to CPS, claiming they had frequently heard Sophie crying alone at night. A distant cousin, who hadn't spoken to Melanie in years, messaged my lawyer, saying she had witnessed strange behavior when Sophie was younger but never thought much of it at the time. Piece by piece, the image Melanie had spent years building was being ripped apart. And then, she made her biggest mistake yet. It was late. I was putting Sophie to bed when I heard it. Loud banging on my front door. My heart dropped. I peeked through the blinds. Melanie. Standing in my driveway. Wild-eyed. Disheveled. Furious. She pounded on the door again. "Open the door, Kara. Let me see my daughter." I didn't move. I just grabbed my phone and dialed 911. By the time the police arrived, Melanie was standing in the middle of the street screaming, accusing me of kidnapping, telling my neighbors that I was brainwashing Sophie. I didn't say a word. The officers gave her one warning to leave. She refused, so they escorted her off my property. And just like that, she lost the last shred of dignity she had left. The next morning, my lawyer called. "The court wants to modify visitation," she said. Because of Melanie's outburst, the judge ordered that any visits between her and Sophie would now be supervised. Melanie hated that. When she heard, she called me. For the first time in months, her voice was soft. "Please, Kara, can we just talk? No lawyers, no courtrooms, just you and me." For half a second, I hesitated. Then I made a mistake. I agreed. We met in a coffee shop, a public place. I walked in, and the moment I saw her, I knew something was off. Because there was a camera crew waiting, a literal news crew. Melanie was already seated at a table, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother. I didn't say a word. I just turned around and walked out. I never spoke to her again. The first supervised visit was set for a Saturday morning. It was at a child-friendly center with a CPS worker watching every second. That morning, Sophie didn't want to get dressed. She curled up in the corner of her bed, clutching her stuffed fox, shaking her head. I brushed her hair, whispered that she'd be okay. But when we got in the car, she was completely silent, When we arrived, Melanie was already there. She stood up dramatically the moment she saw Sophie. She spread her arms wide. "Oh, my baby, I missed you so much." She pulled Sophie into an exaggerated hug, but Sophie, she didn't hug her back. She just stood there, frozen. Melanie leaned down, cupping her face, and in a voice too low for most to hear, she whispered, "Just tell the judge you want to come home, sweetheart. Then we can be together again." The CPS worker's pen moved across the clipboard. Melanie must have realized she had been overheard because she quickly plastered on a bright smile. Tried to act normal. But it was too late. Sophie never looked at her again. When the visit ended, she walked out without turning back. And the moment we got to the car, she broke down. Silent tears. No words. Just shaking. That night, she had her first nightmare in weeks. The next day, CPS officially recommended that the court reconsider Melanie's visitation rights. The judge? He listened. At the next hearing, Melanie tried one last time. She sobbed in court, begged for a second chance. She lied through her teeth, but the judge didn't care. The psychological evaluation, the CPS reports, the testimony, it was all too much. Melanie lost. Full legal custody was granted to me. She was stripped of all parental rights. And when the judge said those words, Melanie turned to me, glaring. And she hissed under her breath, "You stole my child." She was escorted out before she could say more. The adoption went through months later, and on Sophie's 8th birthday, I told her, "It's official. You're mine forever." At first, she just stared at me. Then, her eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around me, gripping me so tightly it took my breath away. And she whispered, "Forever and always." I hugged her back. Forever and always. My parents never reached out again. Melanie, she kept ranting online, but nobody listened. Meanwhile, Sophie flourished. She made friends. She excelled in school. And one day, she called me Mom, without hesitation, without fear, just Mom. And that was the only title I ever needed.